It's the most obvious example of a Jewish movie.
I'm here to audition for Fiddler on the Roof.
Come right in.
It holds its own place in pop culture.
Yeah, and he doesn't look anything like Tevye.
No.
I think it's remembered as this cheery musical
Oh, it was such a shanda.
about this quiet life in the Tzeitel and how things used to be.
Look at Tevye and Golda. They had a wonderful life with that fiddler in the Tzeitel.
But it's wrong. The Fiddler on the Roof is a really sad story, one that a lot of people have resonated with, not just Jews. At its core, Fiddler on the Roof is about change, how it's terrible but also inevitable. And that is something that people around the world and across the years have been able to resonate with.
The film that Norman Jewison directed, close to 1 billion people saw all over the world.
Like many people, you may have seen the movie, you definitely know some of the songs, and you might have even participated in a local production. In fact, the creator of Fiddler on the Roof had this to say.
So essentially, the fiddler is the spirit of the Jewish people.
That is a really bold claim. And so I want to understand what Fiddler on the Roof is trying to tell us.
We announced it already. We made a bargain with the butcher. Stop it!
Fiddler on the Roof addresses the age-old question of finding the balance between tradition and modernity. What makes it special is we get to see this conflict through the eyes of Tevye the milkman. We get to see his world, this little town that's about to come to an end. But to understand Tevye, we need to understand where the story even comes from. The main influence on this movie is Shalom Aleichem, who was an author who wrote these Yiddish stories about Tevye the Milcher, the dairyman, and his daughters. Shalom Aleichem is the pen name of Solomon Rabinovich, who was a Yiddish author at the end of the Tzeitel era. This was a painful and complex time for the Jews of Eastern Europe who were leaving their homes in the small towns and moving to big European cities or to America. This movement of Jews out of the shtetls and into the cities was brought on by industrialization and modernization of the Russian Empire, but also anti-Semitism. The pogroms, or attacks, on Jews in the cities of Kiev and Kishinev were big influences on the writings of Shalom Aleichem and show us a really dark part of the history of Jews in the old country. In fact, in the movie, we get to see this play out in Tevye's life. We see pogroms, attacks on Tevye's town, and eventually they have to leave their shtetl. Now, this movie is directly based on a musical that opened in 1964 called Fiddler on the Roof. And it was also based directly on the Shalom Aleichem stories, but there were some changes made for the American audience. The play was written by Jewish playwright Joseph Stein. The songs are written by Jewish composers Jerry Bach and Sheldon Harnick, while the play was directed by Jewish choreographer Jerome Robbins. Noticing a pattern yet? Yeah, this is a very Jewish production. The creator of the film was a man named Norman Jewison, who, out of all the people here, is actually not Jewish. And he tried to capture the musical at its height in the early 1970s to a more mainstream audience that might not be interested in musicals and might not know things about Judaism. And so to make the film more accessible to people, most of it was recorded in a small town in Yugoslavia. And this gives the story a much more realistic, like a documentary feel, rather than a fun, jolly musical. But there's also an extra layer that the filmmakers added that was inspired by a different Jewish artist. You see, this idea of capturing a town in its final days was also done by Jewish photographer Roman Vishniak, who photographed Jews in Berlin during their final days before World War II. And so Vishniak's images became the basis of the visual language of this movie, and that's why Fiddler on the Roof is so believable, because it feels very real. So where does the name Fiddler on the Roof come from? The name was changed for the musical, and is based on a series of paintings done by Jewish artist Marc Chagall. And so this image becomes the opening idea of the movie and guides us as an audience into how Tevye wants us to understand his story.
A fiddler on the roof. Sounds crazy, no?
The fiddler represents an average person and their state of existence. Every person wants to live their lives as best they can and play their part in the town.
Here, in our little village of Anatevka, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck.
What this image really represents is every person knowing their role and what they're supposed to do in their life by following the way things were done for many years before.
How do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition!
This movie is about the clash between tradition and modernity, old versus new, and the identity which comes along with that.
And because of our traditions, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do.
The reason why we open the film with the tune of tradition and the image of Fiddler on the Roof is because it allows us to understand how Tevye sees the changes in the world around him that are about to come. This is such an important point that the makers of the film wanted to put emphasis on the image and the sound of the Fiddler on the Roof, and so they got one of the best Jewish violinists of the 1970s, Isaac Stern, to play the music in the intro so that the start of the movie is authentically Jewish. So we see that the fiddler represents tradition. It's Tevye's North Star, and it's also how he sees God in this world. Modernity is represented through the character of Perchik, who left the shtetls and went to go study in a university in Kiev. Perchik enters the story right at this moment where the townspeople are hearing about how the world around them is changing.
In a village called Rajenka, all the Jews were evicted, forced to leave their homes.
Foreshadowing. But this also allows us to see Perchik versus tradition.
You should know what's going on in the outside world.
Because change is inevitable, Perchik says it should be embraced.
Why should I break my head about the outside world? Let the outside world break its own head. Well put.
The rabbi, the thought leader of the town, also embraces this idea and is totally closed off to the world around him, even as that world is ending.
If I want bad news, I'll read about Noah and the flood.
That right there is the conflict in a nutshell. Perchik is modern because he accepts the inevitable change of the world around him, but that sets him apart from everyone else in the town.
Girls are people.
A radical.
Go away.
I'd be willing to teach them.
Now, Tevye is in an interesting spot because he's kind of open to what Perchik has to say, but he's also the champion of tradition. And so this puts him right in between this question of tradition and modernity. Tevye strikes a deal with Perchik and decides to take him in, and then Tevye's second daughter, Hodel, and Perchik start debating about this question.
Although I don't know if the rabbi would agree with your interpretation.
The two of them really spell out the tradition versus modernity argument right here.
Our traditions. Nothing must change. Everything is perfect, exactly the way it is.
We like our ways.
Our ways are changing all over, but here. Do you know that in the city, boys and girls can be affectionate without the permission of a matchmaker?
Matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match. Find me a find, catch me a catch.
Ah, the matchmaker. The main way that tradition versus modernity plays out in this movie is through the marriage of Tevye's three daughters. The way that things are done in this town is that the papa picks out the husband for the daughter. But the oldest daughter, Tzeitel, expresses disappointment in this system of arranged marriages.
He's handsome. He's young. All right, he's 62. There's more to life than that. Don't ask me what.
When I was rewatching this particular scene, I was actually reminded of these art pieces called Sad Bride paintings that evoked a similar feeling that was happening throughout the Russian Empire at this time.
We're with no dowry, no money, no family background. Be glad you got a man.
So Tzeitel and the other daughters are expressing this frustration with having no say in who they end up marrying.
It's just that I'm terrified.
So let's actually take a few moments to go through each of Tevye's daughters and to understand the conflict deeper.
Is this the little girl I carried? Is this the little boy at play?
Let's start with the eldest daughter, Tzeitel. She was originally matched with the older butcher, Laser Wolf, and we come to find out that she's actually in love with the poorer tailor named Model.
Even a poor tailor is entitled to some happiness.
When Tzeitel begs her father not to make her marry the butcher, Model seizes the opportunity and begs Tevye to let him marry his daughter.
Times are changing, Reb Tevye. The thing is, over a year ago, your daughter Tzeitel and I gave each other our pledge that we would marry.
Ah, here we go. The times are changing. So Tzeitel and Model are very much still in the Jewish faith, but yet they're breaking tradition.
Some things I will not, I cannot allow. Tradition.
And so here we begin to see why the idea of Fiddler on the Roof is important. Because Tevye sees tradition as a fiddler, a man standing on a roof, you have to make small adjustments, small movements in order to stay balanced. And in Tevye's mind, small amount of bending is okay. What kind of change is too much?
One little time you pull out the prop, and where does it stop? Where does it stop?
Now, this idea of bending tradition in order to stay balanced is a very deep idea, and it applies across every single culture. But in this movie, it deals with Orthodox Judaism as it was practiced in the Tzeitel before modernization. And so to give us a little more clarity about this idea of Orthodox Judaism bending, I want to read you a quote from Jewish writer Abraham Kahn, who wrote this in the early 1900s. The Orthodox Jewish faith, as it was followed in the old towns of Russia, is exactly the same as it was 1,000 years ago. It does not attempt to adapt itself to modern conditions. It is absolutely inflexible. If you attempt to bend your religion to the spirit of your new surroundings, it breaks. It falls to pieces. And so this is the concern that Tevye expresses with his daughter Tzeitel and eventually with his other two daughters. And so he's open to it, he does it, but he is lamenting. He is sad about the fact that he has to bend.
Tradition!
How many times do I have to tell you that Laser Wolf the Butcher was a good provider?
Well, I'm not marrying a butcher.
Then there's Hodel, Tevye's second daughter, who marries Perchik, the radical. We get to see the true clash between Perchik breaking tradition and embracing modern ideas at Tzeitel and Model's wedding. As Tevye is arguing with his guests about the fact that his daughter was supposed to marry the butcher, Perchik has this to say.
They drank on it. An agreement. A sign. It's all nonsense. Tzeitel wanted to marry Model and not Laser.
A young girl decides for herself?
Why not? They love each other.
Love? Terrible.
He's a radical.
Oi, a radical.
It's no sin to dance at a wedding.
But with a girl?
Yes, with a girl.
Well, it's not exactly forbidden, but...
Well, there you see, it's not forbidden.
And it's no sin.
I mean, it could lead to mixed dancing. What am I saying? By breaking the separation between men and women at this wedding, Perchik was openly defying tradition. In Hebrew, we would call him a pirate's geder.
She's dancing with a man!
I can see that she's dancing with a man! And I'm going to dance with my wife!
Tevye seems to cover for his daughter by once again bending his tradition in order to find balance in that situation. But once again, there's a limit. And so when Hodel and Perchik tell Tevye that they're getting married, he is not happy about that.
What do you want from me? Go on! be wed and tear out my beard and uncover my head. Tradition.
Once again, we see how Tevye is trapped almost right in the center of this question, where he has his town and the tradition on one side and his children and the changing world on the other side. And so even though he is angry at Hodel and Perchik, he is still able to come around and see it from their perspective.
Our old ways were once new, weren't they? Did Adam and Eve have a matchmaker?
He even echoes this idea to his wife.
It's a new world, Gonda.
But even though he understands Perchik's idea,
tradition!
Wasn't it yesterday when he was born?
the third daughter, Chava, strays the farthest from the other two and wants to marry a Gentile.
I would be much happier if you would remain friends from a distance.
Intermarriage, a Jew marrying a non-Jew, is the biggest breach of tradition in Tevye's eyes, because that means she is totally leaving the faith and starting a Gentile family.
He has a name, Papa.
Of course. All creatures on earth have a name.
Fietka is not a creature, Papa. Fietka is a man.
Who says he isn't? It's just that he's a different kind of man.
Tevye calls him a creature because marriage with such a person is inconceivable to him. But to Chava, this idea is not so out of the box.
As the good book says, each shall seek his own kind. In other words, a bird may love a fish. But where would they build a home together?
Throughout the film, Tevye is always quoting the good book. But this time, it hits a little bit harder because this time he actually means it. And the key to this clash of tradition and modernity is in Chava's reaction.
The world is changing, Papa.
No, Hodel. Some things do not change for us. Some things will never change.
We don't feel that way.
Tevye is trying to tell his daughter that this path that she's taking is not through Jewishness, but out of it.
Don't you understand what that means, marrying outside of the faith?
But Papa...
No! I said no! Never talk about it again. Never mention his name again. Never see him again.
Tevye tries to see it from Chava's perspective, but he can't. To Tevye, in the fiddler analogy, bending this far, marrying a Gentile, is like falling off the roof. It's the end of the tradition.
If I try and bend that far, I'll break.
And we can see this idea in Tevye's mind visualized in the moment where he's thinking about Chava and his daughters, and he sees how Chava chooses her Gentile husband over the fiddler.
You must not forget who you are.
So we now understand what the conflict is between tradition and modernity. Tevye is trying to make little changes to preserve tradition in the face of his daughter's increasingly modern life decisions. But I want to get a little bit deeper. I want to understand Tevye's Jewishness. The most important thing in life to Tevye is money. In fact, he sings a whole song about this.
If I were a rich man.
Although he says that the husband he wants for his daughters should be learned and a scholar, what he really cares about is material security.
And it won't make one bit of difference if I answer right or wrong. When you're rich, they think you really know.
And this is why he initially agreed to let the butcher marry Tzeitel, and when he lets Muttel marry Tzeitel, he only agrees to it when he hears Muttel say,
I promise you, Reb Tevye, your daughter will not starve.
To Perchik, Tevye's view of money is also very traditional.
What's wrong with being rich?
It's no reason to marry. Money's the world's curse.
Throughout the film, we get to know that Perchik is essentially a communist who goes around and spreads the word of the coming revolution.
In this world, it is the rich who are the criminals. Someday their wealth will be ours.
Oh, that would be nice. If they would agree, I would agree.
And who will make this miracle to come to pass?
People, ordinary people.
Later on in the movie, we get to see Perchik inciting a rally at a paper factory in what I might say is very Trotsky-esque fashion, which of course gets Perchik sent to a labor camp in Siberia. Besides money, the other important factor to get to know Tevye's Jewishness is his relationship with God.
Money's the world's curse.
May the Lord smite me with it. And may I never recover.
The one above is either cursing Tevye with good or blessing him with bad.
Wars, revolutions, floods, plagues, all those little things that bring people back to you.
The one above is always tormenting the Jewish people and personally torments Tevye.
Sometimes I think, when things are too quiet up there, you say to yourself, let's see, what kind of mischief can I play on my friend Tevye?
Tevye sees God's presence as trouble. Throughout the movie, Tevye stops, just looks at the one above, and has a few nice things to say.
I know we are the chosen people. But once in a while, can't you choose someone else?
It's such an interesting inversion of bad things being blessings and good things being curses. Like when Tevye brings home Shabbos guests, and this is how his wife Golda reacts.
Another blessing.
So the truth is that even though Tevye talks a big game about the Torah and being knowledgeable, money is the number one priority. And the fact is that Tevye doesn't seem to know the details behind his traditions.
How did this tradition get started? I'll tell you. I don't know.
Like I mentioned before, Tevye is always quoting the good book, aka the Torah.
As the good book says, heal us, O Lord, and we shall be healed. As the good book says, if you spit in the air, it lands in your face. The good book says... Why should I tell you what the good book says?
Other than that one quote that he said to Chava, I think most of these good book quotes are pretty meaningless. Like, Golda, his wife, is not a fan.
As the good book says, good news will stay, and bad news will refuse to leave. And there's another saying that goes...
You can die from such a man.
And neither are the other people in the town.
There's a famous saying that...
Tevye, I'm not marrying your daughter. I don't have to listen to your sayings.
The truth is that Tevye doesn't really know what it says in the good book, most of the time.
As Abraham said, I'm a stranger in a strange land.
Moses said that.
Forgive me. As King David said, I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue.
That was also Moses.
For a man with a slow tongue, he talked a lot.
By not understanding the reason behind the tradition, it becomes a lot harder for Tevye to give that over to the next generation and explain why they're worth preserving.
As the good book says, when a poor man eats a chicken, one of them is sick.
Where does the book say that?
All right. It doesn't exactly say that.
Now we can get to the final piece of this puzzle, which is the fact that the political landscape of Russia is also changing.
It's hard to be Jewish. It's hard to be Jewish. It's hard to be Jewish in Russia. No.
At the start of the movie, when we met Perchik, we see this moment where the townsfolk are hearing about a nearby expulsion.
In a village called Razhenka, all the Jews were evicted, forced to leave their homes.
The reaction of the Jewish people is to mostly just move on, except first they have to...
May the Tsar have his own personal plague.
Amen.
The world that Tevye was born into was mostly stable for the past few hundred years. But now Europe was changing, and that change was coming for Tevye.
A pogrom? Here?
No. Just a little unofficial demonstration.
Tevye happens to be friends with some of the Gentiles, and so he hears about these pogroms first. And this, of course, is the other example of modernity, which threatens the balance of the Fiddler on the Roof.
Personally, I don't know why there has to be this trouble between people. but I thought I should tell you. It won't be too bad. I wouldn't worry.
But Tevye warns no one and just goes on with the wedding. And even though these are the same Gentiles that Tevye was dancing with in the tavern just recently, when they arrive at his wedding, Tevye has this hope that maybe their good relationship would be enough for them to spare his event. But it wasn't enough. And as we see footage of the pogrom happening in the town, we also see Tevye looking up at God. I can't help but think about what is going through Tevye's head in that moment. Like, is he thinking that this was inevitable, like Perchik was talking about? Or maybe this is divine retribution for some transgression?
Why should I break my head about the outside world? Let the outside world break its own head. Well put.
Either way, the persecution of the Jews only intensifies.
Have you seen the constable lately?
No, why?
There's some rumors in town. We thought since you knew him so well, maybe he told you what is true, what is not.
The Jews of Anatevka have to leave their town.
Tevye, how much time do you need to sell your house and all your household goods?
How did I come to deserve such an honor?
We can see again Tevye's personality, where he calls this terrible news an honor because he sees God as someone who blesses him with hardships and curses him with luxuries. But once again, we're faced with this question of why.
The entire district must be emptied. I have an order here!
But this corner of the world has always been our home. Why should we leave?
I don't know why. There's trouble in the world. Troublemakers.
It's at this point that we get to see the influence that Vishniak had more than any other moment in this movie. Because as the people are saying goodbye to their town, we see the people almost frozen in time, like a mixture between a photograph and a documentary. It's almost more real than real life. And as the townspeople are getting ready to leave, Tevye makes this one comment.
Someone should have set a match to this place years ago.
Chaim Topol, the actor who played Tevye, explained in an interview once that the survivors of Europe in the 18 and 1900s would look back at their life and their childhood in the Tzeitel with a very tragic sense of, I told you so. And so that's what Tevye meant in that moment.
You should know what's going on in the outside world.
In Jewish thought, there's an idea that human experience can boil down to three elements: Olam, Shana, and Nefesh. Space, time, and soul. And we can see how these three elements come together at the close of the movie. At the start of the movie, Tevye explains to us how these three elements work together.
We stay because Anatevka is our home.
The Olam, the world, was Anatevka.
Because of our traditions, we've kept our balance for many, many years.
Many years. That's time. And so, because this movie is about change, when tradition starts to bend, Tevye remarks about his time and space. Like when his first daughter stays in the faith but breaks tradition.
Where do you think you are? In Moscow? In Paris? Where do they think they are? America?
And at the end, when everyone has to leave the town, the first two elements of their lives have been overturned. Their space is gone, and all the time that they put into their town is gone too.
Chicago, America? We are going to New York, America. We'll be neighbors.
Now, the 1960s saw a lot of change in America and around the world. And so all of a sudden, this very Jewish character in this very Jewish play begins resonating with mainstream audiences. And then comes along this film made by a Goyish director with a Jewish last name, which also resonates with millions, maybe billions, of people around the world. The message of Fiddler on the Roof is something that resonates with people, young and old, Jewish or not, because of this theme of inevitable change and the struggle of people to adapt to it. And it deals with these issues of modernity. How much can a tradition bend in order to stay balanced before it breaks? But the biggest reason why it resonates is because it captures all three elements of human experience: the space, the time, and the soul of the people of Anatevka. But that third element, soul, it's not so easily removed like time and space. We see this as Tevye and his family are leaving their town and leaving their space and time behind, and yet Tevye hears the sound of the fiddler and motions to him to come along. Even though this movie is really sad, and the Yiddish stories that they're based on are even sadder, this story allowed American audiences growing up right after World War II to reconnect with the spirit of their ancestors in the old country. And so now I think we can understand the quote from Norman Jewison about the fiddler.
And at that point, when they're leaving in great despair, again it happens. Yum bum 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 bum. And he turns and he looks, and there's the fiddler, standing all alone. He says, "You're going to forget me? Are you going to leave me behind? Are you going to leave your spirit behind?" So essentially, the fiddler is the spirit of the Jewish people.
Thank you for being here to the end of this episode of Yiddish Shekino Club. I'm curious which side you resonated with more. Was it Tevye, or was it his daughters, or Perchik? Here on Yiddish Shekino Club, we cover one big theme in a movie about Jews each week. So if there's a movie that you think I should cover, you should let me know. Next week, we're once again talking about tradition and modernity, this time in a coming-of-age story set in the Orthodox Jewish world in Chaim Potak's The Chosen.